Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study of great chapters of the Bible. Probably the slide you're looking at gives it away. You know what we're going to study today, right? Story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you got your Bible, you can turn there with me. We'll be reading through the whole chapter. 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath is a favorite with everybody because it's an exciting story of David's battle, which really wasn't all that much of a battle. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's this exciting story, this confrontation between this huge giant of a man and the unlikely contender, David. Now, by the time we get to 1 Samuel chapter 17, King Saul, Israel's first king, had already established himself as a kind of warrior king. He was successful in many battles. But he also had another problem. His problem was disobedience to God. And his insecurity as far as his place as king began to bother him more and more, and eventually it drives him into a kind of madness. And if you know the story of King Saul, then you know all about that. In the previous chapter, 1 Samuel 16, God had decided that because of Saul's outright disobedience, it was time for him to be replaced. And so God has Samuel, a prophet and a judge, to go and anoint a very unlikely future king of Israel, a young shepherd boy named David. And while it would take some time for David to finally assume the throne, it would be a dangerous journey for David. And a lot of those dangers would come from the very king, King Saul, whom David himself served and would eventually replace. But this episode in David's life, in 1 Samuel 17, gives us a clear indication why David is described as a man after God's heart. So let's read about it. Let's read about Goliath's challenge to the Israelites in 1 Samuel 17, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now, when the Israelites gathered their armies for battle, and they gathered at Saul, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Saul and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, 'Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us.' Again the Philistines said, 'I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.' When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." And we'll stop there. Now, take a look at this map in this next slide. You'll see that the valley of Elah connects the Philistine city of Gath, which is Goliath's hometown, with the Judahite city of Bethlehem, further east. That's David's hometown. And we have this example of an open valley, not a narrow meandering canyon as many of the wadis are. This is a wide valley. And although it mentions mountains, they're more of large rolling hills than anything. So it's got this kind of stadium seating on both sides. As you look at this view, we're looking from the north to the south. So you see that Azekah, Gath, they're to the right, which is west, and Saco is to the left, which is east. But considering the layout of this terrain, the wide valley with the large hills on either side, it makes a lot of sense that the battle would have occurred here at this place. And notice with me how Saul is described, or rather how Goliath is described to us. He's described as a violent man. He's a champion, it tells us. The word champion comes from a phrase that means between the two, and it referred to somebody who would compete or fight in representative combat with a representative from a foreign army. And that's what you see here. He's calling out somebody. Give me a man that we may fight, he says. We learn later on that he's been a warrior from his youth up. Now, we don't have any idea how old Goliath is, but obviously this is a guy with some violent experience under his belt. And he's also described as a huge man, a big man. Take a look at this graphic here. We see here that, here it is, that if David as a young man was about 5'2", then he was vastly overshadowed by Goliath. It tells us that he was, let's see, he was 6 cubits and a span high. A cubit was about 18 inches, and a span was anywhere from 6 to 9 inches. So Goliath would have stood about 9 foot 6 inches high. That's a big man, even bigger than the Shaq, who is a great basketball star. Consider also it spends a lot of time describing his equipment, his armor. We're not all that familiar with shekels, which are a weight, a unit of weight, but the amount of shekels that it gives to us would have been the equivalent of about 125 pounds. And his spearhead alone was 15 pounds. And you figure this guy, this huge giant of a man, decked out in metal, would have cut quite an imposing figure in as he stood and defied the ranks of Israel to give him a man to fight with. But we also see that he was an arrogant man. He was as insolent as he was imposing. He questions their resolve. He says in verse 8, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array?" In other words, he's saying, if you're unwilling to fight, why do you even line up for battle? He ups the ante. This is not just for territory, he says. If you win, we'll be your slaves. But if we win, then you will serve us. And then, of course, he insulted the Israelite army themselves. The word defy that is used here in verse 10 is to taunt, to annoy, to heap shame on them. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's mocking them. He's making fun of them. He obviously thinks that because of him, the Philistines have the upper hand. And obviously, the sight of this man, along with his boastful tauntings, have their effect. We're told in verse 11 that when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Those two terms, dismayed and greatly afraid, they're used synonymously. In fact, they're used again later on in verse 24. They mean that the Israelites were terrified, and not just scared, they were doubly so. We see that it's used here for emphasis, to give us a good indication of just how unnerved Saul, the mighty warrior, and his Israelite army were. But I got a couple of questions. First of all, where's Abner, Saul's tough commanding general? Where's Jonathan, Saul's son, who had previously distinguished himself in battle against other of Israel's enemies? And where's Saul himself, who we're told when he was anointed king was head and shoulders above all Israel? He himself is a pretty tall guy. We're not told exactly how tall, but he is not only a tall guy, he's distinguished himself in battle before. Where are all these tough guys of Israel? Well, of course, the story isn't about them. In fact, it's not even about Goliath. The story is about David. The story is about David and his unwavering faith, not in himself, not in the Israelite army, but in God. And so David makes his arrival. Let's read beginning in verse 12. It says, "Now David, the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, he had 8 sons. Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. The 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the second to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. Now the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem. The Philistine came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took his stand. Then Jesse said to David his son, 'Take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back news of them. For Saul and they and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines.' So David rose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper, and took the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. The men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel.' Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, 'What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the armies of the living God?' The people answered him in accord with his word, saying, 'Thus it will be done for the man who kills him.' Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, 'Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle.' But David said, 'What have I done now? Was it not just a question?' Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before." Now, David enters the scene here, and I want us to see how immediately we see some contrasts between David and Goliath. Goliath is a fearsome man. He's a man of war. David is a shepherd boy, and not a very highly respected one, at least by his brother at that. Goliath stands before his army as kind of a commander. David, on the other hand, is on an errand from his father. "Go see how my sons are doing," David's father tells him. Goliath holds the Israelites in fear. He's a fearsome man. David, on the other hand, is being bullied by his older brother, Eliab. Goliath is a man who trusts in himself, whose confidence is in his own ability. David, on the other hand, has trust in the living God. And Saul makes this desperate offer. He says in verse 25 that anybody who's able to kill this man will get rich. He'll have my daughter, and your father's household will be tax-free in Israel. And David, on the other hand, seems more deeply disturbed that a Philistine, an uncircumcised man, therefore an outsider to the covenant of Israel, would be so bold as to taunt, to heap shame on the Israelites, the armies of the living God, he calls them. So Goliath's words to David are not just an insult to some scared soldiers, it's an insult against God himself. And David says, who does he think he is? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that would taunt the armies of the living God? David's offended, and rightly so, and he's filled with this righteous indignation. And so he makes an offer to be the man. In verse 31, it says, when the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth. He's been a warrior from his youth. David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. When he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may Yahweh be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his garments and put on a bronze helmet on his head, and he gathered him, or rather he clothed him with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not yet tested them. So David said to Saul, I can't go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off, and he took a stick in his hand, and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now, we see at first where David's bravery is dismissed by Saul. Saul cites David's youth. We don't have any idea exactly how old David was, probably a teenager. But he also cites his inexperience. You're just a kid, Saul says. And this guy has been a fearsome fighter since he was a kid. But David countered with his own experience. He may be only a shepherd boy, but he was acquainted with danger, and he certainly knew how to step up to responsibility and to duty. And he outlines how he had been in dangerous situations before and had fought wild animals barehanded and succeeded and won, prevailed against those animals. So to him, it seems like fighting Goliath would be just like fighting any other wild beast, although admittedly a much larger one. But David's confidence was not in his own ability. Rather, he says that it was God who delivered him in verse 37, and God will continue to deliver him. And so Saul seems visibly impressed, or maybe he's just desperate. And so, since no one else had stepped forward, Saul doesn't have any choice but to gamble on this brave boy. And so, in a blessing that is as much a prayer as it is a blessing, he bids David to go with God. But Saul also wants to make sure that even though he's prayed, David has some practical help. And so he equips him with armor that is a lot of Saul's own equipment. And he probably figures, yes, I've prayed, but it probably wouldn't hurt to add some weaponry to this kid. He feels probably like he's sending him out to certain slaughter. But the outfit provided by Saul proved to be not practical, but unpractical. In fact, David couldn't even walk in it, much less fight in it. And so David provides his own weapons. In verse 40, he took his stick, his shepherd's staff in his hand, and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. David chose for himself weapons that he was comfortable with, weapons that had obviously served him well as a shepherd. And it's implied to us that David is proficient in these these weapons. We read in the book of Judges where the Benjamites were very good with the sling. It's told to us that they could hit a hare from far off and not miss using a sling. Now that takes skill, takes practice and proficiency. And obviously David feels all he needs is his staff, his sling, some stones, and his faith in God. And that's about as simple and courageous as it gets. And so David and Goliath make their approach. Read with me in verse 41. It says, "Then the Philistine came and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come out to me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, 'Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field.' Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day Yahweh will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands.'" Now, we see Goliath's disdain evident in his taunt. First of all, he insults David's weapons. He tells him, "What is that, a stick? You know, come out to me and spank me like a dog," basically is what Goliath is saying. And then he insults David by cursing David by his Goliath's gods. His gods here refer to Goliath's gods, and probably he was calling upon them to help him decimate this young boy who would come out to him with a slingshot. And David's probably thinking, what good are curses from non-existent gods? Finally, he threatened to kill David and to dishonor his corpse by leaving it out for the birds and the beasts to pick at. But David has confidence, and his confidence again is not in himself, but in his true weapon, Yahweh of hosts, he's called, the God, the living God of the armies of Israel. David obviously believes that God is an awesome God, one of power and might, who doesn't take to the taunts that Goliath had been heaping upon God's own army. And so the way that David saw it, Goliath and the Philistines are the ones who are outnumbered, not the other way around. Next, we see in David's confidence, he tells Goliath, "You're going down. It's you, the big man, who's going to fall." And not only that, but he says you're going to end up headless to boot, and your army's corpses are the ones who are going to be dishonored. And finally, David says, all of this is so that people will know that there is a God. Read with me again in verse 46 and 47. David says, "This is so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." And then he names him, "that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands." There's an important point to be made here. God never does anything just because he can. When he does something mighty and courageous in the form of what David is about to do, he does it so that people will know that he is there, who he is, and what his power is. It's the same kind of wording that was used in the book of Exodus when Moses came and told Pharaoh that God was going to act. And then he said repeatedly, "that you may know Yahweh, that you may know the Lord." Again and again and again, God has shown us that throughout history, he does these mighty acts so that we can know not only that he exists, but also what one's proper response to his existence ought to be. And David is utterly confident. He believes that the battle belongs to God, and he's ready to have it done. And so we come to that battle. In verse 48, read with me. It says, "Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone." Remember, he had gotten 5. He only pulls 1 out. It's all you can put in one of those little leather pouches in a sling. "And he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out from its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Shoraim, even to Gath and Ekron. The sons of Philistine returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent." For David and Goliath, this battle was over as soon as it began. It seems that Goliath didn't even get the opportunity to draw his sword. It was still in its sheath, when David uses it to behead Goliath. And Goliath didn't even stand a chance. It was one and done, right? 1 stone. David got 5, but he only really needed 1. Felled by a single stone, this huge, big-talking man fell to the ground, crashed to the earth. While David hastened to finish the job, just as he promised it would, David said, "I'm going to cut your head off." But he didn't have a sword with him. All he had was a slingshot. So he used Goliath's own sword to cut off the big man's head. And we should note that all of this was in accordance with God's law. In Leviticus chapter 24 and verse 16, it says, "Moreover, the one who blasphemes the name of Yahweh shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him." Well, in this case, only one did, and that was David. "The alien as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death." And in a panic, when they see that their champion is dead, the Philistines split. Obviously, they have no intention of fulfilling the bargain that their own champion had made. "Oh, if you beat us, we'll be your slaves," right? That's not what they intended to do. They ran away. They were cut down, in fact, on the way to the relative safety of their own cities. And when the Israelites came back from doing that job, they plundered the camp, all because of David's bravery, courage, and utter faith in God. True, the battle is the Lord's. In verse 55, it says, "Now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, 'Abner, whose son is this young man?'" Now, earlier chapters tell us that David had already had some interaction with Saul. Saul had become increasingly unpredictable, and David was able to play music to soothe Saul's moods. But it's obvious that Saul didn't pay all that much attention as to who this young man was. And Abner says, "By your life, O king, I don't know." The king said, "You inquire whose son the youth is." So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. David is still carrying the head of and it must have been a giant head of this Philistine that he had just conquered. Saul said to him in verse 58, "Whose son are you, young man?" Listen to David's answer. It's full of humility. "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." With Goliath's head still in his hands, David's answer is one of humility. He doesn't even name himself. He says, I'm the son of your servant Jesse. Of course, little does Saul know the consternation that awaits him later as this son of Jesse's star rises in Israel. It's an exciting story, to be sure. And there are certainly some things that Christians today can learn from it. Here's just a few things. You could probably think of more, but we're going to take a look at 3 quick things we can learn from the story of David and Goliath. First of all, we should realize that we ought to use the tools that God provides. Too often, we improvise with man-made implements and devices to fight spiritual battles, when what we need is faith. We need confidence in God. And as long as we have that confidence, we can be, as Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, more than conquerors. Let's go there together. Romans chapter 8. In Romans 8, we're going to begin in verse 33. Paul asks, who will bring a charge against God's elect? Now think about that for a moment. That's what was going on back in the scene that we had left in 1 Samuel 17. Goliath was the one bringing the charge of cowardice and irresponsibility and failing to defend themselves as God's army should. He says, who will bring a charge against God's elect? Who can do that? When God is the one who justifies. And who is the one who condemns? When Christ Jesus is he who died, yes, rather he who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. And who will separate us from the love of God? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Now, Paul is saying we have our own giants, and they don't necessarily come in the form of a giant warrior from Philistia. Sometimes those giants are circumstances, are difficulties. They're spiritual battles. And we need spiritual weapons to fight them with. In verse 37, he says, in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing. There is no giant in your life, he says, that will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. In 1 Peter chapter 4, let's go there together. In 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter tells us that certainly, since the battle does belong to the Lord, he is the one who is going to provide us the strength that we need to fight it. In 1 Peter 4 and in verse 12, Peter says, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also with the revelation of his glory you may result with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Now, we'll stop right there for a moment. How does all this happen? Look at verse 11. In verse 11, he says, whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Second, realize that God can use anyone. Now, David was the youngest in his family, and probably the least likely that anybody thought would defeat this giant, much less later on become king of Israel. But God worked through him to save the Israelite people, not just this time, but a number of times. And that's what God does. He uses the unlikely to accomplish his purpose. Go with me to the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians 1. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul the Apostle addresses this this very thing. In 1 Corinthians 1, in verse 26, the apostle says, "Consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things that are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before God." And in fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 12 through 16, we won't turn there, but I hope you will later, Paul uses himself as that very example, an unlikely candidate to accomplish God's will, to do God's purpose. Finally, it's important that we see Jesus in this story. Can you see how this ancient story of 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath, points to Jesus? You see, David wasn't what was expected by the Israelites in a champion. And Jesus wasn't what the Israelites expected in a Messiah. He was no conquering warrior, at least according to their eyes. He was no political hero to help them throw off the shackles of Rome and establish themselves as a mighty nation once again. No, he worked in a way that nobody expected. In the book of Philippians chapter 2, go there with me. Probably this passage is familiar to you. Let's read it together. Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, it tells us about Jesus who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. It's easy to see that there are some comparisons that we can make with David. Humility is one of those things. Obedience to God is another. But Jesus, to some the most unlikely champion of all, accomplished God's purpose in a way that hardly anybody saw coming. And no matter what we think, God is able. God is able. So put your trust in him to overcome whatever giant you may be facing in your life right now. Thanks for joining us in another study of great chapters of the Bible. And hope you'll see us again. Hope we'll see you again. God bless you.